Today we're going to talk about the basics of cellular respiration, and the goal of this video is to describe the process of cell respiration and identify some of the structures in cells that are used in this process. So let's start by asking this question. Why do you need to breathe? We need to breathe in order to get oxygen, but you can always ask a follow-up question, why do we need oxygen? Well, oxygen is required to transform the food you eat into a usable form of energy for your cells. And that usable form of energy is called ATP. So, what is ATP? The ATP stands for this: adenosine triphosphate. It is a nucleic acid, and notice that there are three phosphates. You see the three P's in green there. So that's where it gets that triphosphate name. The bond between the second and the third phosphate is a high energy bond. There's a lot of energy stored in that bond. And so when the ATP molecule, when it's got these three phosphates on it, it's like a fully charged battery that the cell can use. Now, an enzyme comes along called ATPase, and it breaks the bond between the second and third phosphate. It breaks that bond in a process called hydrolysis. And when that bond is broken, energy gets released, and that's the energy that the cell is able to use. Now, the cell is going to use that to perform various functions. Once that third phosphate is broken off, what you're left with is ADP. Okay, so that stands for adenosine diphosphate. The di meaning there are only two phosphates now, there's not three. And because that high energy bond has been broken and some energy has been released, think of this molecule ADP like a partially charged battery. There's still some energy left in the remaining bonds on those phosphates, but some of the energy has been used up. That's why it's just a partially charged battery at this point. Okay, so this leads us into cellular respiration. What is cellular respiration? It is the process in which cells use oxygen to transform the energy in glucose into ATP. This occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. And briefly, I'll mention that glucose that you're trying to transform into ATP. That glucose is comes from the food that you eat. So when you breathe, you take in oxygen, and when you eat, you take in glucose, and you're going to use that oxygen to transform the glucose into ATP. That process is called cellular respiration. And you'll notice in the image here, this is a mitochondria that you see, this pink. It kind of looks like it's shaped like a pill, but this is an organelle within just one cell. It's called the mitochondria, and it has several parts that I've labeled, but the two most important parts that I want you to pay attention to are called the cristae. Those are the folds on that inner part, and then the matrix is the part in blue. So those will be important structures that are used during cellular respiration. Okay, so first, here's the chemical equation for cell respiration. You have glucose, which I mentioned a moment ago. That comes from the food that you eat, and oxygen, which you take in when you breathe. Okay, so you have glucose plus oxygen. Those are your reactants, and you're going to use those to produce three things: carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. And again, think of that ATP like a fully charged battery. So you're using this equation shows you what you use in order to create ATP. So there's glucose and oxygen. Those are your reactants. And then you have carbon dioxide, water, and ATP as products. Now, to do that reaction, there are three steps. These are the three steps of cellular respiration. Step one is called glycolysis. This step is anaerobic, meaning this step does not require oxygen. And this step happens in the cytoplasm, which is the space outside of the mitochondria. Step 2 is called the Krebs cycle. This step is aerobic, meaning that it does require oxygen. And this step happens in the matrix, which is this part inside the mitochondria that's blue here. Then step 3 is called the electron transport chain, and that step is also aerobic, meaning it requires oxygen, and it happens in the cristae, those folds that I mentioned a moment ago within the mitochondria. So these are the 3 steps that you have to go through in order to make those 3 products that I listed on the previous slide: carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Okay, so now let's look at the specific inputs and outputs of each step. So during glycolysis, what is it that goes in and what comes out? During glycolysis, what is it that goes in and what comes out? One glucose molecule goes into glycolysis, and what you split that glucose in half, and that creates these 2 smaller molecules called pyruvate. So what comes out of glycolysis are the 2 pyruvates, and you also get a net gain of 2 ATP. So you gain 2 ATP from that step. Now, the 2 pyruvates are then going to be the inputs of the next step, the Krebs cycle. So those 2 pyruvates go into the next step, the Krebs cycle, and what comes out of the Krebs cycle is the carbon dioxide, specifically 6 carbon dioxide molecules, and you also generate 2 ATP during that step. Then, in the final step, the electron transport chain, the oxygen that you breathe in, 6 oxygen molecules go into the electron transport chain, and here's what comes out: 6 water molecules and 34 ATP. So the step that makes the vast majority of the ATP is the electron transport chain. But if you add this up, that's a total of 38 ATP that you can create during cellular respiration. So that would be like 38 little batteries that the cell can use from this process. So putting it all together into this one picture, you can see that we've got 3 steps here: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. During glycolysis, glucose goes in, and you get 2 ATP coming out, and that glucose molecule is split in half into 2 pyruvates. Those 2 pyruvates go into the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle creates 2 ATP, and out comes the 6 CO2 molecules. Then the oxygen that you breathe in goes into the electron transport chain, and what comes out of that are 6 water molecules and 34 ATP molecules. So if you add the total ATP up, 34 from the electron transport chain, 2 from the Krebs cycle, and 2 from glycolysis, you get a total of 38 ATP molecules. Now, how does cellular respiration relate to photosynthesis? This image summarizes the process pretty well. These 2 processes form a cycle with one another, and the products of one are the reactants of the other. So just look at this image. The chloroplast within plant cells is where photosynthesis takes place. The mitochondria is where cellular respiration takes place. During photosynthesis, oxygen and glucose are produced, and those products of photosynthesis, those same molecules go into the mitochondria. So those are now the reactants of cellular respiration, and out of the mitochondria comes 2 products, 3 products, water, carbon dioxide, and chemical energy, which is ATP. So the water and the carbon dioxide, those become the reactants for photosynthesis. So those go into the chloroplast, and you can see this cycle that forms.